And today, the Supreme Court has answered that question by a vote of 6-3.
The U.S. Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling.
Major Second Amendment case.
Major Supreme Court ruling.
The government just crossed a dangerous line. Imagine being inside your own home, no warrant, no warning, and suddenly law enforcement bursts through your door and starts shooting. This isn't some fictional thriller. It's the actual foundation of a Supreme Court case currently being argued, one that could fundamentally reshape your Fourth Amendment protections and your defense against warrantless gun seizures. The case builds upon a landmark 9-0 decision that already rejected one unlawful search. But now Montana is pushing to broaden that authority. And the Supreme Court is preparing to decide whether your front door truly remains a constitutional barrier or merely a formality. If you value your rights and view your home as your ultimate sanctuary, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe now, because this ruling could transform everything for gun owners across America. Chapter 1, a case that could reshape Fourth Amendment rights. The new case approaching oral arguments is Case vs. Montana. And this isn't simply about one individual's constitutional protections. It's about the rights of every American. It raises the question, can law enforcement enter your residence and confiscate firearms based on nebulous concerns, without probable cause, and without obtaining a warrant? This case could either reinforce or dramatically expand one of the most significant rulings in recent memory, Caniglia versus Strom, where the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against warrantless home entry. Case var. Montana revolves around Trevor Case, whose former girlfriend made vague reports to authorities. Officers arrived at his residence, peered through windows, and found no imminent danger. Yet without securing a warrant or receiving any response, they entered regardless, and shot Case while he was inside his closet. He survived the encounter and is now requesting the court suppress the firearm and all evidence obtained. The Montana Supreme Court ruled against him in a narrow 4-3 decision. Now the United States Supreme Court will render its judgment. This transcends a local dispute. It's potentially establishing a national framework governing how far police can intrude into your home under the justification of emergency. Chapter 2. Why this should deeply concern gun owners. This case doesn't merely involve your right to security within your residence. It's about whether your firearms can be confiscated without due process of law. The state contends officers acted under a supposed emergency exception. But what happens when that emergency is founded on speculation rather than genuine threat? Officers never witnessed Trevor Case engaging in violent behavior. His ex-girlfriend couldn't even recall the specifics of her concerns. Nobody possessed a warrant, yet they entered the home regardless. The officer who shot him later acknowledged he had just let one fly. This prompts a fundamental question. What prevents the identical scenario from happening to you? Gun owners have historically depended on the Fourth Amendment to protect their homes, but this case forces us to ask, is that protection still meaningful? Chapter 3. Caniglia vi. Strom, the precedent. They're attempting to undermine. The current case references a 2021 Supreme Court decision, Caniglia versus Strom. In that case, officers deceived their way into a home and seized firearms without authorization. The court ruled unanimously in favor of the homeowner. So why is Montana attempting to distort that decision in their favor? In Caniglia, a husband placed a gun on a table during a domestic disagreement. The following day, officers entered the residence after the wife granted permission, but only based on false information they provided. The homeowner had explicitly denied consent, yet officers confiscated his firearms anyway. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the community caretaking exception was inapplicable. That ruling emphatically reaffirmed that homes deserve the most robust Fourth Amendment protections available. Now Montana is requesting SCOTUS to scale back those protections, using Caniglia as their launching point to justify expanded exceptions. Chapter 4. Emergency aid or convenient excuse. Montana argues that officers entered under an emergency aid exception, claiming no warrant is required when they believe someone faces danger. But this legal pathway has clear limitations. It demands probable cause, not merely intuition or ambiguous worry. And that's precisely where this case crosses into dangerous territory. Trevor Case wasn't threatening anyone when officers arrived. They waited approximately 40 minutes outside before entering, hardly an urgent response. No sounds of distress were detected, and no other individuals were endangered. Yet they still entered, heavily armed and without any coherent plan. One officer fired through a closet curtain without properly identifying a target. This isn't emergency aid in action. This is a legal loophole that, if validated, could grant the government sweeping authority to bypass constitutional protections. Chapter 5. The Trump DOJ enters, but supporting. Which side? The Trump administration has inserted itself into this litigation, but surprisingly, not in defensive case. They filed a brief supporting the state of Montana, advocating for a reduced legal threshold when it comes to emergency entries into private homes. The Trump DOJ argues these searches should only be measured by a reasonableness standard that would eliminate the requirement for probable cause before entry. Reasonableness is inherently vague and dangerously susceptible to manipulation. Remarkably, even Montana and the Trump DOJ disagree on how this standard should actually function. Case's legal team warns that accepting this approach could effectively eviscerate the Fourth Amendment entirely. If SCOTUS sides with Montana and adopts this framework, it could establish a nationwide precedent that systematically erodes protections for gun owners, starting at your doorstep. Chapter 6. The shadow of Caniglia looms large. The defense in Case v. Montana is relying heavily on precedent, Caniglia v. Strom. That case dismantled the community caretaking doctrine and reinforced the necessity of probable cause. Caniglia involved a husband who was transported to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Police deceived his wife to gain entry and confiscated his firearms without obtaining a warrant. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against that action. They made abundantly clear that the Fourth Amendment requires more than mere concern. It requires demonstrable cause. Trevor Case's legal team wants this new ruling to reaffirm that principle. Concern alone is insufficient. You need a genuine, verifiable emergency. Chapter 7. A residence, a curtain, and a gunshot. The events inside Trevor Case's home were both dramatic and disturbingly unclear. According to officer testimony, a curtain moved, and within 4 seconds a shot was fired. They claimed they observed Case's face and a dark object, but Case was struck in the arm and abdomen without proper identification. Officers later conceded they may have acted purely on instinct. One admitted he let one fly immediately after seeing the curtain shift. Trevor Case argues this demonstrates they acted recklessly and without justification. His legal team contends all evidence should be excluded, beginning with the warrantless entry itself. Chapter 8. The critical battle. Reasonableness versus probable cause. One of the most consequential legal disputes in this case centers on which standard police must satisfy when entering your home during an alleged emergency. Is it probable cause, which requires concrete evidence, or merely reasonableness, a nebulous term that invites potential abuse? The Trump Department of Justice and the state of Montana contend that in emergency aid scenarios, officers only need a reasonable belief that something is wrong, not actual evidence. They argue that demanding probable cause is excessively restrictive and could prevent rapid response in time-sensitive situations. But Trevor Case's attorneys forcefully counter, warning that this so-called reasonableness standard is dangerously ambiguous and unpredictable. They maintain that the home deserves maximum constitutional protection, and weakening the entry standard would fundamentally violate the Fourth Amendment. This debate isn't about arcane legal terminology. It's about whether police can force their way through your front door based on nothing more than a hunch. And if the court sides with Montana, the very definition of privacy within your own residence could be transformed immediately. Chapter 9. Even the government can't define its own standard. Here's where the situation becomes particularly troubling. Even the two parties supposedly aligned can't agree on how this reduced reasonableness test should actually operate. That's an enormous warning sign. The Trump DOJ and Montana both advocate for emergency entry with less than probable cause, but their legal briefs directly contradict each other regarding how that test should be implemented. One seeks a broad interpretation based primarily on officer discretion. The other proposes a more constrained framework with clearer parameters. Trevor Case's legal team highlighted this inconsistency directly to the justices, emphasizing just how unstable and undefined this standard truly is. If government attorneys can't articulate it clearly, how are law enforcement officers expected to apply it consistently, or citizens supposed to challenge it effectively? The fact that even the advocates of this test cannot properly define it demonstrates exactly how hazardous it is. The court is being asked to approve a rule that could fluctuate based on subjective interpretation. And that's precisely the type of legal ambiguity the Constitution was crafted to prevent. Chapter 10. What's genuinely at risk for gun owners nationwide. This case extends far beyond one individual in Montana. It could establish the framework for how law enforcement engages with every gun owner in America, particularly within their homes. A ruling favoring Montana could weaken the legal barrier protecting your residents from unauthorized entry and firearm confiscation. It could authorize police to act on incomplete reports, subjective feelings, or anonymous community tips, with no requirement for probable cause or a warrant. And if that becomes binding national precedent, every subsequent case could reference this decision to justify increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. The original Caniglia v. Strom ruling was a unanimous 9-0 victory for privacy and gun rights. Now that boundary is being challenged. This case transcends search and seizure protocols. It's about defending the core principle that your home is your castle, and that nobody, not even the government, can violate that sanctuary without compelling lawful justification. What transpires here will reverberate far beyond Montana's borders. Conclusion: defend the boundary before it shifts. The home is sacred. The rights of gun owners are non-negotiable. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about every legal confrontation that threatens your constitutional freedoms. Because if we fail to establish the line, someone else will draw it for us. And next time, they might draw it straight through your front door.